The kitchen smelled like pot roast, and it was 6:52 p.m. on a Thursday in August, 7 days before I was supposed to move into a dorm 4 hours away, when my father set down his fork and said, "So, we need to talk about the tuition account." I remember the exact temperature of the room shifting before he even finished the sentence. My mother wouldn't look at me. My brother Tyler, 22 at the time, was very interested in his mashed potatoes. "We moved it," my father said. "Tyler's got a real shot at something. You can always just take out loans. That's what loans are for." $38,000. 9 years of birthday checks, summer job paychecks, and a small trust from my grandmother, all of it sitting in an account with my name on it, gone, transferred to fund a truck detailing franchise my brother had decided 3 weeks earlier was his calling. I didn't cry at that table. I set my fork down, very carefully, the way you set something down when you're not sure your hand will stay steady otherwise. But here's what none of them knew, sitting in that kitchen congratulating themselves on believing in Tyler. 9 years later, I would be the one standing in a conference room reviewing exactly what happened to that money. Because by then, reviewing exactly what happens to money would be my entire profession. Welcome back to Home of Secrets. I'm Wren, 27, a forensic accounting consultant from Richmond, Virginia. This is the story of how my parents took my tuition money to fund my brother's business a week before college, and how, 9 years later, I ended up being the one hired to find out exactly where that money actually went. If you've ever been told your future was less important than someone else's chance, stay with me. Drop a comment and subscribe, because the numbers in this one do not lie. I was 10 when Tyler, 15, wrecked the family lawnmower trying to do tricks with it. And my father's response was to buy a replacement within the week and tell Tyler, "Just be more careful next time, bud." That same summer, I'd saved $340 mowing neighbors' lawns to buy myself a bike, and when I asked my mother if she could drive me to the store to pick it out, she said she was too busy with Tyler's stuff that week, so I rode my old broken chain bike to the store myself and wheeled the new one home on foot, 4 miles, because nobody offered to help. That was the shape of things in our house from as early as I can remember. Tyler's failures got soft landings. My successes got, at best, a nod. I graduated high school with a 4.0 unweighted GPA, president of the accounting club 2 years running. Yes, my high school had an accounting club, and yes, I ran it, and a national merit commendation that my mother mentioned to exactly one person, my Aunt Ruth, and only because Ruth asked directly. Tyler, meanwhile, dropped out of 2 different associate's degree programs by the time he was 22, both times funded in full by my parents, both times described afterward as him just needing to find his real path. I have a small brass trophy from that accounting club, 3rd place in a regional case study competition my senior year. It sits in a drawer in my apartment now. It never once made it onto a shelf in my parents' house, not even the shelf in the hallway, where Tyler's participation trophies from a decade of youth sports sat gathering dust, every single one of them displayed, none of them earned through anything resembling actual achievement. I'd started that tuition savings account myself at age 9, depositing birthday money, and, later, paychecks from a part-time grocery job I held all through high school, 20 hours a week at $8.25 an hour, starting at 16. My grandmother added a small trust disbursement when I turned 18, bringing the total, by graduation, to just over $38,000. Money I had built, dollar by dollar, specifically so I could attend college without leaning on my parents for a cent. Because some part of me already understood, even at 9 years old, that leaning on them for anything came with a cost I didn't want to pay. I want to walk you through what happened after that dinner, because the story doesn't end at the kitchen table. That's just where it starts. I had exactly 7 days before move-in, a partial academic scholarship covering tuition at a school I'd already committed to, and suddenly, no savings to cover the rest. Housing, books, the gap. The scholarship didn't touch. I took out $19,000 in federal and private student loans that first year alone, co-signed reluctantly by my father, who seemed to view co-signing the loan as a kind of moral equivalent to having funded my education outright. Over the next 4 years, I worked through college, a work-study job in the accounting department, 25 hours a week, plus tax season overtime at a local CPA firm, while also carrying a full course load and finishing with a 3.81 GPA. By graduation, I'd taken out a total of $61,000 in loans across 4 years. Money that, if the original $38,000 tuition account had simply stayed intact, I would never have needed to borrow in the first place. Meanwhile, Tyler's truck detailing franchise folded within 14 months, the $38,000 having covered, according to what my parents told extended family at the time, startup costs and inventory. Tyler pivoted to a different venture, a food truck, this time, that my parents helped fund again, a further $12,000, which also folded within a year. By the time I graduated college, Tyler was on his 4th business idea, an investment consulting venture he described at Thanksgiving that year, with the specific confidence of someone who has failed enough times to have simply stopped noticing the pattern. I sat through that Thanksgiving dinner, freshly $61,000 in debt, listening to my father tell my Uncle Ray that Tyler was just wired differently, an entrepreneur at heart. It takes guts to keep trying, while I was introduced, in the same conversation, as our other one. She's very buttoned up, good with spreadsheets. Buttoned up. 9 years of building something from nothing, reduced to a description of my aesthetic relationship to office supplies. At a family barbecue 3 years after graduation, my mother mentioned to a neighbor that Tyler was between ventures right now, just recalibrating. And when the neighbor asked what I did, my mother said, "Oh, Wren does taxes, I think." Something like that. Despite the fact that by then I'd made partner track at a mid-sized firm and had started building my own consulting client base on the side. I set my paper plate down on the picnic table, quietly, and didn't correct her, because by then I'd stopped expecting the correction to land differently than it ever had. I paid off the last of my $61,000 in student loans, the spring I turned 26, a moment I marked entirely alone, transferring the final payment from my apartment kitchen table at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. Nobody else aware it was happening. Nobody else needing to be. I want to be precise here, because this story doesn't have a single dramatic breaking scene the way some do. The kitchen table dinner, 7 days before college, was the breaking scene. Everything after it was consequence. But I'll tell you about the dinner in full, because it matters that you understand exactly how it happened. My mother had made pot roast. My favorite at the time, which in hindsight I think was meant to soften what was coming, the way you give a shot with a piece of candy afterward. My father waited until we were most of the way through the meal, then set his fork down and made the announcement plainly, without much preamble. The tuition account, my account, had been moved to fund Tyler's franchise, and I could just take out loans. I asked, quietly, how they could do that without telling me first. My father said, "It's a family decision, Wren, not just your money." A sentence that has stayed lodged in me for 9 years, because it directly contradicted every single time I'd been told, growing up, that the account was mine to manage, mine to grow, mine to be responsible for. My mother didn't say much of anything. Tyler, when I looked at him, shrugged and said, "I mean, I didn't ask them to do it that way," which was, in its own quiet way, an admission that he'd known and hadn't stopped it and hadn't offered to give any of it back. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I finished the pot roast on my plate, thanked my mother for dinner, and went upstairs to my room, where I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time before opening my laptop to see exactly how much financial aid paperwork I had 1 week to complete from scratch. Nobody came upstairs to check on me that night. Nobody, in the 9 years since, has ever brought that dinner up to apologize for it. There wasn't a dramatic severing of ties in this story, the way there sometimes is. I was 18, about to leave for college, with no bills of my parents to cancel, and no locks to change. What I did instead, in the years that followed, was quieter and slower. I simply stopped extending trust in the specific place it had been broken. I never again told my parents the balance of any account I held. I never again let them know the specifics of my student loan totals, my salary, my savings, anything financial, because I had learned at 18 exactly what family decision could mean when it came to money I'd built myself. When Tyler's second venture folded, and my father called asking if I could help out for a bit, I said, plainly and without anger, "I don't have anything extra right now," which was true, because I was still paying off the very loans his and my mother's decision had made necessary in the first place. I built my accounting career the same procedural, patient way I do everything: an internship, then an entry-level position, then, 5 years in, a CPA license, then, 2 years after that, enough of an independent client base on the side to eventually go out on my own with a small forensic accounting practice, partnering with a more established consultant named Delia Ochoa, who took me on as an associate and eventually a full partner. I didn't build any of it to prove a point to my parents. I want to be honest about that. I built it because I genuinely love the work, following a trail of numbers until they tell you something true nobody wanted to say out loud. It just so happened, 9 years later, that the trail led somewhere I never expected. There was no dramatic public campaign against me in this story, no rumors spread through a church or a town. My family's version of a smear campaign was quieter and more insidious, the kind that happens over 9 years instead of 9 weeks. At every family gathering, the narrative solidified a little further. Tyler was the ambitious one who just hadn't caught his big break yet, and I was the cautious one, the safe one, occasionally even the lucky one, as my mother once put it. Lucky that accounting worked out so well for her. As though 9 years of $61,000 in loans and 80-hour tax seasons were luck, rather than the direct, foreseeable result of the exact money that had been taken from me. I didn't correct any of it out loud. What I did instead, quietly, over those same 9 years, was keep records, not out of any plan for revenge, but simply because it's professional instinct by now. Every loan statement, every payment, the original tuition account withdrawal notice, which I'd requested a copy of from the bank the month after it happened, 18 years old, already understanding I might someday need to prove what had actually occurred. Delia, my mentor and eventual partner, once asked me, offhand, over lunch, why I kept such meticulous personal financial records when most people my age barely balanced a checkbook. I told her, honestly, I had to learn early that nobody else was going to keep the real numbers for me. She didn't ask for the story behind that. She just nodded, the way people do when they recognize something true without needing the details. 9 years after that dinner, a mutual industry contact referred a new forensic engagement to Delia's firm. A small business facing an involuntary bankruptcy petition from a creditor, needing an independent forensic review of its books before a mediation session. Delia handed me the file, as she did with most new engagements at that point in my career, without either of us realizing, until I actually opened it, whose business it was. Tyler's Consulting Group, LLC, my brother's fourth venture, the investment consulting business he described at that long-ago Thanksgiving, now facing an involuntary bankruptcy petition from a creditor owed $84,000 in unpaid vendor invoices. I told Delia immediately, before opening a single additional file. Conflict of interest disclosure. Full stop. The same instinct that governs everything in this profession. Delia thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to say, "You didn't create this conflict. And honestly, given your family history, you might be the only person positioned to actually find whatever's really going on in these books, instead of getting spun a story." We brought in outside counsel to formally clear the engagement, disclosed the family relationship to the creditors' committee in writing, and proceeded only once everyone agreed I could remain impartial, which, professionally, I fully intended to be, whatever else this case turned out to mean to me personally. What the books showed took 2 weeks to fully untangle. The original $38,000 from my tuition account, transferred into the truck detailing franchise 9 years earlier, had never been fully invested in the business at all. Bank records showed $22,000 of it spent within 4 months of the transfer, a used truck for Tyler's personal use, a down payment on a boat, and a trip to Cancun charged directly to a business account and later reclassified, sloppily, as a client entertainment expense. Only $16,000 had gone toward actual franchise costs, a business that folded 14 months later regardless. The pattern repeated, with variations, across the food truck venture, and now this consulting business. Money moving in, a portion diverted to personal expenses, losses reported to my parents, as the business still working through some hurdles. I sat with that discovery the same way I'd sat with the $38,000 loss 9 years earlier, quiet, at my desk, running the numbers twice to be sure. This wasn't about a bad business decision anymore. It was a pattern, 9 years long, and my parents had funded every iteration of it without ever once looking closely enough to notice. What came next was entirely procedural, governed by the ethics of my profession, rather than any personal agenda. My role was to produce an accurate forensic report for the creditors' committee and the mediator. Full stop. Not to punish Tyler, not to expose him to my parents, simply to tell the truth the numbers actually contained. I documented everything precisely. The $84,000 owed to the vendor creditor, the $22,000 in misallocated personal expenses across the truck detailing venture 9 years prior, similar smaller diversions in the food truck venture, and, most immediately relevant to the current bankruptcy petition, $31,000 in current business funds that had followed the same pattern. A portion routed to a personal account within the last 18 months, reported to investors, including my parents, as reinvested capital. My parents, it turned out, had put $40,000 into this fourth venture as well, on top of everything before it. Money I hadn't known about until this engagement. Money that, per the records, was already substantially gone. Tyler found out I was the forensic consultant on the case 4 days before the scheduled mediation session, when the report was formally shared with all parties, including my parents, who were attending as investors with a stake in the outcome. He called me that night, agitated, saying, "You're really going to do this? Bury me in front of Mom and Dad? Over something that happened 9 years ago?" "This report is about the last 18 months, I said. "The 9-year-old part is just context for the pattern. I didn't create the pattern, Tyler. I just found it, because that's the job I built for myself after you and Mom and Dad took the money that would have let me build a different one." The mediation session took place in a conference room at Tyler's attorney's office. 11 people around a long table. The creditor's representative, the mediator, Tyler and his attorney, my parents, Delia, and me, presenting the forensic findings in my capacity as the retained consultant, formally disclosed conflict and all. I walked the room through the report, the same way I would for any client. Plainly, sequentially, numbers first. The $84,000 creditor debt, the $31,000 in misallocated funds from the current venture. Then, because the mediator specifically asked for context on the business's broader financial history, given the investor structure, the 9-year pattern, the truck detailing franchise, the $22,000 in personal expenses disguised as business costs, the food truck venture's similar shortfalls, the original $38,000 that had funded all of it, money that had once been my college tuition. My mother's face changed somewhere around the mention of the Cancun trip. My father said nothing for a long stretch, staring at a printed bank statement in front of him, with dates on it he clearly hadn't seen before. "This is a 9-year-old business decision," Tyler's attorney tried, "not relevant to the current proceeding. It's relevant to the pattern the creditors' committee asked me to establish," I said, calm, even. "And it's relevant because every dollar in this report traces back, eventually, to an account that had my name on it a week before I left for college." My father finally spoke. "Wren, we didn't know it went to a boat down payment," he said, quiet, and for the first time in 9 years, something in his voice sounded less like defensiveness and more like genuine shock. "You didn't ask," I said. "Nobody asked. For 9 years, nobody in this family looked closely enough at any of Tyler's numbers to notice the pattern, including the first time, when the money you were looking closely enough to take was mine." Tyler, cornered, did the thing people do when the numbers finally catch up to them faster than their explanations can. He raised his voice, said something about how I'd always been waiting for a chance to make him look bad. The same tired refrain from that long-ago Thanksgiving about being wired differently, except this time, nobody at the table was nodding along. The mediation resulted in a structured settlement. Tyler's Consulting Group LLC was liquidated. The $84,000 creditor debt, paid in part through asset sales, with Tyler personally responsible for the remaining balance under terms that will take him years to satisfy. My parents' $40,000 investment in the fourth venture was almost entirely unrecoverable. A small fraction was returned through the liquidation, pennies on the dollar. Tyler's credit was, by every account I've heard since, badly damaged, and he moved into a small apartment on his own, for what I understand is the first time in his adult life. No parental cosign in sight. My parents' view of Tyler didn't collapse overnight. 9 years of narrative doesn't dissolve in a single conference room, but something shifted. My mother called me 3 weeks later, and, for the first time in my adult life, asked to see my old tuition account statements, the original ones, from 9 years prior. I sent them. She was quiet on the phone for a long time after reading them, and then she said, "I think we told ourselves a story about Tyler because it was easier than the one about you," which is not quite an apology, but it was, from her, close enough to matter. As for me, my forensic practice picked up 2 new referrals directly from that mediation, attorneys who'd watched how I handled a genuinely difficult conflict of interest and wanted that same rigor on their own cases. I took that little brass third-place trophy out of the drawer in my apartment a few months later and put it on a shelf, finally, next to my CPA license, not because either of them needed the validation anymore, but because I decided I was done keeping my own evidence of effort hidden in a drawer. It's been almost a year since that mediation. Tyler and I talk occasionally now, careful, still rebuilding something neither of us has a clear template for. My parents ask about my work these days, actual questions, the kind that require them to have been listening. It's not everything. It's more than I had 9 years ago at that kitchen table. Nobody sat me down and apologized for the $38,000. Not really. Not in so many words. But I think, in the end, the report did the apologizing. The words never could. It just took the shape of a ledger instead of a sentence, which, honestly, suits me better anyway. If you've ever had your future quietly spent on someone else's chance, you already know that the truth about where the money went doesn't disappear just because nobody wants to look. It waits, patiently, in bank statements and invoices, for someone who knows how to read them. Sometimes that someone ends up being you. If this one hit close to home, share it with someone who's ever been told to just take out loans while someone else got the gift. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have said at that dinner table. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There's more where this came from.